The building of Chartres Cathedral was not just an act of faith, it was the largest single economic project of its time, employing thousands of workers and redirecting wealth from across Europe. By the year 1200, the construction site had become a small city of its own. Quarries in the Loire Valley sent stone by river barge. Forests in the Isle de France were felled for timber scaffolding. Glassmakers from Germany and Italy produced the famous deep blue windows that would later be called Chartres blue. The money to pay for all of this came from rents on lands donated by nobles, from taxes collected as tithes, and from the pockets of pilgrims who came to see the cathedral's relic, a cloth said to have been worn by the Virgin Mary. The bishop and the chapter of canons who ran the cathedral managed a budget that dwarfed most counties in the kingdom, and that was the point. We tend to imagine medieval cathedrals as purely spiritual monuments, expressions of faith reaching toward heaven. But that image, while not exactly wrong, is dangerously incomplete. When you look at what these buildings actually did, they functioned as the economic and political infrastructure of their age. They were banks where merchants deposited money and could take out loans. They were markets where fairs were held in the cathedral's shadow, drawing traders from across the continent. They were tax offices where tithes and rents were collected and recorded. They were seats of local government where the cathedral chapter negotiated with kings and settled disputes. The building itself was a machine for generating revenue through pilgrimages, through the sale of candles and indulgences, through the fees charged for the fairs. It created jobs for masons, carpenters, glassmakers, and laborers. It stimulated entire industries from quarrying to transport to textile production. It concentrated wealth in the city and made Chartres a hub of commerce. This reframes our entire understanding of the Middle Ages. The church was not just one institution among many. It was the operating system of medieval society. It owned more land than any king. It collected its own taxes, operated its own courts, and even fielded armies when necessary. The cathedral chapter at Chartres was not merely a religious body. It was a corporation that managed land, lent money, and negotiated directly with the crown. The first stone foundation at Chartres was laid on a system of land tenure, tithe collection, and financial management that had been perfected over centuries. That infrastructure made possible the great architectural achievements we still admire today. But if the church was the infrastructure, who exactly controlled it? And how did that power eventually slip away? Those questions lead us into a deeper story, one that begins not with stained glass or flying buttresses, but with dirt. The foundation of all medieval wealth was land, and the church had more of it than anyone else. To understand how cathedrals became the engines of medieval society, we have to start at the ground. And that ground was vast. By the height of the medieval period, scholars estimate the church owned somewhere between 1/4 and 1/3 of all the land in Western Europe. In some regions, the figure was even higher. The bishopric of Durham controlled a territory larger than many counties. The Abbey of Cluny in Burgundy oversaw an estate network that stretched from central France into Italy and Germany. When William the Conqueror's surveyors compiled the Domesday Book in 1086, they found that the English church already held roughly 1/4 of the land in the kingdom, and that figure would only grow over the following centuries as new gifts and purchases swelled its holdings. How did the church acquire so much? The most common route was through final bequests. A nobleman approaching the end of his life would grant a parcel of land to a monastery or cathedral in return for prayers for his soul. Over generations, these small gifts accumulated into vast domains. Land was also given as penance for crimes, as payment for political favors, and as endowments for new religious houses. It was not always voluntary. Bishops often pressured individuals in vulnerable circumstances, particularly those near death, framing the transfer of land as a spiritual necessity. Then there were the monastic pioneers, the Cistercian order founded in the late 11th century, deliberately sought out marginal land, swamps, forests, and wilderness that no one else wanted. They drained wetlands, cleared woodlands, and turned these barren tracts into productive farms. Their efficiency was remarkable. Within a few decades, Cistercian abbeys became the most profitable agricultural enterprises in Europe, producing vast surpluses of grain, wool, and timber that they sold across the continent. By the 12th century, their network of granges and farms had turned wastelands into some of the most fertile land in Europe, a transformation driven not by spiritual withdrawal but by aggressive economic expansion. Once acquired, church land rarely left its hands. Under canon law, ecclesiastical property was inalienable. It could not be sold, mortgaged, or given away without special permission from the Pope. This meant that church estates accumulated steadily over centuries, while noble families saw their holdings fragmented and lost through inheritance, war, and debt. The church's land base just kept growing, and in medieval society, land was the foundation of all economic power. It produced the agricultural surplus that fed cities, funded armies, and bought luxury goods. It determined political influence because land meant tenants, tenants meant knights, and knights meant military force. A bishop who controlled 100 manors could field a larger army than most counts. The revenue from church estates, rents paid in grain, wine, livestock, and coin, provided the steady income that made everything else possible. The building programs, the charity, the diplomacy, and the power struggles. This explains why the church was not merely a spiritual authority but a territorial power. When the Bishop of Durham ruled his domain, he did so as both a religious leader and a feudal lord, with the same legal rights and military obligations as any secular noble. The land gave him that status. Without that base of ownership, the cathedrals, the pilgrimages, the banking, and the political maneuvering that defined the age would have been impossible. The church's infrastructure was built on soil, and that soil was measured in millions of acres. Land gave the church its foundation, but land alone does not generate a constant stream of cash. Agriculture is seasonal, harvests fail, rents come in once a year. For the church to function as the infrastructure of medieval society, it needed a steady, predictable flow of income that reached every corner of Europe, no matter who owned the soil. That system already existed. It was called the tithe. The tithe was not a voluntary offering. It was a mandatory 10% tax on all agricultural produce, laid down in canon law and enforced by the threat of excommunication. Every farmer, every villager, every lord who worked the land was expected to set aside 1 out of every 10 sheaves of grain, 1 of every 10 lambs, 1 of every 10 barrels of cider. This was not a donation dropped into a collection box. It was a systematic extraction, measured and collected, often with the same rigor a royal tax collector would have applied. Monasteries like St. Gall kept detailed records of who owed what, when, and whether they had paid. The monks noted each household's holdings and tracked payments across multiple seasons, adjusting expectations when harvests were poor but rarely forgiving a debt entirely. Defaulters faced escalating penalties, a fine, then a public penance, and finally, for the truly stubborn, exclusion from the sacraments. In a society where salvation was the ultimate concern, that was a powerful tool of enforcement. But the tithe did more than fund the local parish priest. A portion went to the bishop, a portion went to the cathedral chapter, and a portion, through mechanisms like Peter's Pence, was pulled all the way to Rome. Peter's Pence was a penny per household, collected annually and shipped to the papacy. It was effectively an international tax, one of the first in European history, and it gave the Pope a direct financial pipeline into every diocese in Christendom. The pennies added up to a substantial sum, enough to sustain the papal court, subsidize crusading ventures, and extend Roman influence into the most remote parishes. That kind of centralized revenue system was something no secular king could match. Monarchs had to negotiate taxes with their nobles, often failing. The Church, by contrast, had a machine that ran on religious obligation and social pressure, extracting wealth from the entire population regardless of political boundaries. Yet the tithe system also created a complication. Because it was tied to agricultural production, the Church's income fluctuated with the harvest. In good years, the coffers swelled. In bad years, the Church had to compete with secular lords for scarce grain, and peasants often resisted handing over the tenth when they themselves were starving. Historical records document these confrontations, farmers hiding their crops, whole villages refusing to open their gates to the tithe collector, communities banding together to resist ecclesiastical authority. And because the tithe was collected at the local level, it gave monasteries and cathedral chapters enormous leverage over their communities. They knew exactly how much each family produced. They controlled the schedules of payment. They decided when to forgive a debt and when to demand every last penny. The tithe collector became a figure of both necessity and resentment, a constant reminder that the Church's reach extended into every barn and field. That power did not go unnoticed by kings. The tithe system made the Church a parallel fiscal state, but it also made it a target. Secular rulers began to wonder, if the Church can tax the land, why can't we take a share? If the Church had simply stockpiled the wealth from tithes and land rents, it would have become a target of resentment even faster than it already did. But the Church spent that wealth, and it spent it on something that reshaped the medieval economy, the cathedral. Think about what a cathedral project actually demanded. The building of Notre Dame de Reims, Canterbury, or Chartres was not a weekend renovation. It required the coordinated effort of hundreds, often thousands, of workers over decades. At Chartres, the construction of the current cathedral, begun after the fire of 1194, employed a rotating workforce of masons, carpenters, blacksmiths, quarriers, and laborers that at its peak may have numbered several thousand. And those workers did not just materialize from nowhere. They came from surrounding villages and distant cities, drawn by wages. That meant food production had to increase to feed them, roads had to be maintained to supply them, and entire temporary settlements sprung up around the building site. The economic ripple effect went far beyond wages. Each cathedral consumed staggering amounts of raw materials. Stone from local quarries, timber from managed forests, lead for the roof, iron for the structural ties, glass for the windows. Each of those materials required its own industry. Quarrying, cutting, and hauling stone kept dozens of teams employed for years. The glass for a single large window could involve the output of a whole workshop for months. The scaffolding alone, a forest of timber, required the coordinated effort of carpenters and foresters. And this was not just a local affair. Imported materials such as the fine limestone from Keene used in English cathedrals, or the colored glass pigments from across Europe, stimulated long-distance trade. Shipping companies profited, merchants extended credit, and the cathedral chapter itself became a major consumer that could make or break local industries. When a cathedral chapter placed an order for 100 wagon loads of stone, that commission might sustain a quarry for a generation. Then there were the specialized trades and guilds that grew up around cathedral building. Master masons became celebrities, traveling from city to city, commanding salaries comparable to senior clergy. Sculptors, carpenters, glaziers, and metalworkers formed overlapping networks of expertise. The cathedral workshop functioned as a training ground, turning apprentices into journeymen who would later spread across Europe and build the next generation of churches. In that sense, the cathedral was a vocational school, a university of craft, but the most profound effect was on the city itself. A cathedral under construction was a magnet for commerce. Merchants set up stalls to sell food, tools, and clothing to the workforce. Money changers did brisk business converting different regional currencies. Land values around the building site rose, and new inns and bakeries opened to serve the constant flow of visitors and pilgrims. When the building was finally consecrated, the economic life of the city had been permanently transformed. The cathedral became the anchor of a new urban economy. Consider Rheims. The city's prosperity in the 13th century was directly tied to the massive rebuilding project, which attracted artisans and money from across Champagne. The cathedral chapter managed a budget that rivaled that of the local count. The construction itself became a kind of public works program, distributing wealth from the church's revenues back into the hands of thousands of workers and suppliers. So the cathedral was not just a monument to faith, it was the largest and longest-running infrastructure investment of the medieval world, an infrastructure that paid for itself in economic development, creating skilled labor, diversified industries, and urban growth that outlasted the builders themselves. The stone walls were a kind of stored capital, and every completed vault was a statement that the church had transformed tax revenue into tangible, permanent prosperity. That discovery alone forces us to see these buildings not as mere religious art, but as the engines that drove the medieval economy forward. Throughout the Middle Ages, if cathedrals were engines of local stimulus, pilgrimage was the fuel that kept those engines running for centuries. The great pilgrimage routes of medieval Europe did not just move souls toward salvation. They moved people, money, goods, and ideas across vast distances on a scale that rivaled any trade network of the age. The sheer volume of pilgrim traffic is hard to grasp today. By the 12th century, the road to Santiago de Compostela in northern Spain was handling perhaps 500,000 travelers a year, every year for over 3 centuries. That is not a trickle of devout individuals, that is a seasonal migration, and every one of those pilgrims needed food, shelter, a pair of shoes, a walking staff, and a souvenir. The economic impact hit hardest along the routes themselves. Towns on the way of St. James in France, such as Vézelay, Conques, and Toulouse, grew wealthy not from any natural resource but from their position as way stations. They built hospitals and hostels, pilgrim hospices, often run by religious orders but also staffed by local workers who sold supplies, mended clothes, and provided transport. The church managed these facilities, charging fees or accepting donations, and the revenue flowed into cathedral treasuries. These facilities were profitable investments that generated income through fees and donations. In Rome, the influx of pilgrims for Jubilee years created a temporary city within a city, with entire districts devoted to lodging and food. The Lateran Palace and the Vatican itself became vast economic zones, managing pilgrim donations and selling indulgences that funded everything from church repairs to papal wars. But the most visible commercial side of pilgrimage was the relic trade. A major relic, a splinter of the true cross, the bones of a saint, a vial of the Virgin Mary's milk, could transform a modest church into a pilgrimage destination overnight. The Abbey of Saint Denis outside Paris became one of the richest in Europe after acquiring the relics of Saint Denis and his companions. The Cathedral of Santiago de Compostela claimed the remains of the Apostle James, which turned a remote Galician town into a destination that attracted pilgrims from England, Germany, and Italy. And that meant money. Pilgrims made offerings at the shrine, bought lead badges or scallop shells as tokens of their journey, and donated to the church's upkeep. In Canterbury, the shrine of Thomas Beckett generated so much revenue that the cathedral priory became one of the wealthiest monastic houses in England, managing properties as far away as London and Calais. Competition between pilgrimage sites was fierce. Towns rewrote their histories, invented new saints, and sometimes even stole relics from one another to attract the pilgrim market. The monks of Conques famously acquired the relics of Saint Foy by sending a monk to infiltrate the monastery in Agen and steal them, a story they told proudly. Why? Because possessing Saint Foy turned Conques from a remote village into a major stop on the Santiago route, with all the economic benefits that came with it. The church officially condemned such theft, but the practice was so common that it had a name, fer to sacra, or sacred theft. This was not simple piety. It was economic competition dressed in spiritual robes, yet this very success created a deep complication. The very success of pilgrimage as an economic engine created tensions that the church could not fully control. As the flow of pilgrims and donations increased, so did the temptation to exploit it. Relic forgery became routine. Indulgence sales grew increasingly aggressive, and by the late Middle Ages, the sale of indulgences had become a massive fundraising operation that would eventually spark the Reformation. The infrastructure of pilgrimage, the roads, the hospices, the markets, the relic industry, had turned the sacred journey into a commercial enterprise so deeply integrated into the medieval economy that the church could no longer separate its spiritual mission from its financial interests. What began as a means of grace had become a system of revenue generation, and the very buildings that housed the relics became banks, markets, and tourist attractions all at once. This powerful transformation raised an uncomfortable question. If pilgrimage was such a profitable business, who was really in charge, the saints or the ledger books? So for all the drama of pilgrimage routes and relic thefts, it was the monasteries that formed the quiet, steady backbone of the medieval economy. Unlike the cathedrals, which were urban centers of wealth and spectacle, monasteries were often set deep in the countryside. And that was precisely their economic advantage. They had land, lots of it, and they had the discipline and the labor force to transform that land into something far more productive than any ordinary feudal estate. When the Cistercian order emerged in the late 11th century, they deliberately sought out remote, undeveloped areas, swamps, forests, wastelands, and they did not just build a church and a cloister. They built an agricultural corporation. Each Cistercian house operated a network of granges, centralized farms run by lay brothers who never left the monastery. These granges were not subsistence farms, they were specialized production units. One grange might focus entirely on sheep, another on grain, another on vineyards. The same order that had vowed poverty was running what historians now call a multinational agricultural enterprise. Take the Cistercian monastery of Clairvaux in France. By the mid-12th century, it controlled dozens of granges spread across hundreds of square miles. Its wool production was so massive that it supplied cloth merchants as far away as Florence. The Abbey of Citeaux itself marketed its wine across Europe. Monastic barges carried goods down the Rhine and the Danube. The Cistercians even developed their own breed of sheep, the famous Cistercian longwool, prized in the textile centers of Flanders. This was not just farming, it was a sophisticated system of surplus extraction and long-distance trade. The same skills that made the monks expert at copying manuscripts also made them expert at keeping ledgers. They recorded every transaction, every shipment, every contract. The medieval monastery was both a factory and a warehouse. Its scriptorium produced illuminated manuscripts that were sold to nobles and churches across the continent. Its cellars stored wine and grain that were shipped hundreds of miles. Its walls sheltered traveling merchants and pilgrims who brought news, goods, and coin. But the real genius of the monastic economy was its resilience. Because monasteries were permanent institutions, they could invest in long-term improvements that no individual lord would risk. They drained marshes, built roads, dug canals, and introduced crop rotation. They turned marginal land into productive farmland. The Cistercians alone are credited with reclaiming vast tracts of Western Europe, effectively adding millions of acres to the arable land supply. In an age when land was the ultimate source of wealth, the monasteries were not just participants in the economy, they were the ones expanding it. This economic power was not invisible. It was written into the landscape. The Abbey of St. Gall in Switzerland owned land so widely scattered that its estates stretched from the Alps to the Rhine. Its abbots managed a portfolio that included vineyards, salt mines, and toll stations, and these were not exceptions. Across Europe, the largest and most stable economic units were monastic. The great Abbey of Cluny controlled over 1,000 houses, each feeding wealth back to the mother abbey. A single donation to Cluny could involve entire villages, forests, and hundreds of peasant families. The concrete discovery here is that the medieval monastery was not a retreat from the world. It was the world's most efficient economic machine, operating across borders, dominating trade networks, and pioneering agricultural techniques that would not be matched by secular landowners for centuries. The monks were not just praying for the world, they were running it, and that created a paradox. The same institutions that promised spiritual perfection had become the most perfected engines of material production. That contradiction would not go unnoticed by the kings and merchants who began to realize that the true power of the church lay not in its prayers but in its balance sheets. But this economic power did not stay confined within the cloister walls. It spilled out into the churchyard itself. Walk into almost any medieval town on market day, and you would find the cathedral square transformed into a bustling commercial hub. Stalls packed against the very walls of the nave, merchants haggling under the shadow of the spire, and this was not an accident of convenience. It was a deliberate system that blurred the line between the sacred and the commercial in ways that would shock a modern churchgoer. The church controlled the market, literally. In many towns, the cathedral chapter held the right to grant permission for markets and fairs, and to collect fees from every transaction. The scales used to weigh goods were often kept inside the church itself, sometimes even on the altar, because that was where the official standards were stored. The currency exchanged was minted under ecclesiastical authority in some cases, and the church provided the only reliable system of weights and measures across a fragmented feudal landscape. When a merchant complained about a short measure, he appealed to the bishop's court, not the king's. Part of what made churchyards so attractive for commerce was the legal protection they offered. The right of sanctuary meant that a man could not be arrested on consecrated ground for most debts. This made the church square the safest place in town for conducting business, especially for travelers who feared arbitrary seizure by a local lord. Even the timing was regulated by the church calendar. Major fairs were held on saints' feast days, drawing crowds for the religious observance and then keeping them for the shopping. A prime example was the Great Fair of Saint Denis just north of Paris. By the 12th century, it had become one of the biggest commercial events in northern Europe, attracting traders from Flanders, Italy, and the Rhineland. The Abbey of St. Denis controlled the fair completely, collecting tolls on every cart, every bolt of cloth, every barrel of wine. The abbot's officers enforced contracts and settled disputes. For a few weeks each year, the monastery functioned as a state within a state, running a trade hub that surpassed most secular markets. Even the famous Champagne fairs, often cited as the birthplace of European long-distance commerce, operated with heavy church involvement. The Counts of Champagne granted the privileges, but the church provided the notaries, the oaths, and the enforcement of credit agreements. Of course, this arrangement created friction. As towns grew wealthier and more self-aware, their merchant guilds began to resent the church's control over their economic life. Why should the bishop take a cut of every transaction? Why should the cathedral chapter have the power to set market days and prices? In city after city, the 13th and 14th centuries saw bitter disputes between the civic authorities and the cathedral over market rights. The churchyard was supposed to be a place of peace, but it became a battleground for economic sovereignty. and that conflict between the sacred space that generated wealth and the civic powers that wanted to seize it only deepened the central paradox. The very infrastructure that made commerce possible also made it contested, and if the churchyard could be a market, it could also be a bank. The very stone walls that made a cathedral sanctuary also made it the safest place to keep treasure. Throughout the Middle Ages, cathedrals and monasteries functioned as the closest thing Europe had to a banking system. Their treasuries were not just liturgical storehouses for chalices and vestments. They were fortified vaults where kings, nobles, and even cities deposited their most valuable assets. The logic was simple. The church's property was theoretically protected by divine law and excommunication, and its buildings were built to last. A chest locked inside a cathedral treasury was safer than any castle keep, and because the church was everywhere with houses in every town, it could offer something no individual lord could. A network. The records of Canterbury Cathedral show that its treasury held not only the Archbishop's registers and the relics of Thomas Beckett, but also bags of silver entrusted by local merchants, sealed deeds from distant abbeys, and the personal jewels of King John. The king himself pawned the crown jewels to the monks of Canterbury in the early 13th century. That was not a casual transaction. The cathedral chapter drew up a formal contract, set a repayment schedule, and demanded interest in the form of annual gifts. When the king defaulted, the treasure stayed. That kind of arrangement made the church a creditor to the crown, a relationship that gave it enormous leverage. But the banking function went far beyond simple safekeeping. The church also lent money, and it lent it on a scale that shaped political outcomes. When a city needed to rebuild its walls after a siege, it often turned to the local cathedral chapter for a loan secured against future tax revenues. When a noble needed to finance a pilgrimage or a crusade, he could mortgage his lands to a monastery. The interest was often disguised as a gift or a donation to avoid the sin of usury, but the economic mechanism was identical to modern lending. The abbot of Cluny once made a loan to the King of France that effectively turned the abbey into the royal banker for several decades. The most sophisticated example of church banking came from a monastic military order. The Knights Templar, originally founded to protect pilgrims on the road to Jerusalem, the Templars quickly discovered that their true value lay in finance. Pilgrims traveling to the Holy Land did not want to carry heavy bags of coin through bandit-infested roads, so the Templars offered a service. Deposit your money at a temple commandery in London or Paris, receive a coded letter of credit, and present it at the temple in Jerusalem to withdraw the same amount, minus a small fee. This was in essence a medieval traveler's check. It required an international network of secure houses, standardized accounting, and trust. The Templars provided all three. The Templar network operated across borders without the backing of any state. It worked because the order was seen as incorruptible, bound by monastic vows, and protected by papal authority. A merchant in Marseille could transfer funds to a merchant in Acre simply by depositing silver at a temple commandery and trusting the order's internal bookkeeping. That system handled the equivalent of millions of modern dollars every year. The Templars even began to offer letters of exchange for long-distance trade, effectively inventing a tool that would become the basis of later European banking. The Church's role in money transfer and deposit banking is often overlooked because it contradicts the popular image of a medieval economy dominated by barter and simple coinage. In reality, the Church was not just a passive recipient of tithes and rents. It was the manager of a continent-wide financial system. The same cathedrals that soared toward heaven also sat on vaults full of gold, secured with multiple locks guarded by the dean and the chapter. And when the king needed to raise cash for a war or a city needed to rebuild after a fire, they knew exactly where to go. The Church was not merely the landlord of Europe. It was its creditor, its safe deposit box, and its clearinghouse. That financial infrastructure was every bit as real as the stone pillars that held up the roof. And it was just as hard to replace. That economic power, control of land, rents, tithes, and banking, translated directly into the most tangible form of medieval authority. Bishops were not just landlords, they were feudal lords. In the Holy Roman Empire, this dual role was formalized in the figure of the prince-bishop. These men were simultaneously spiritual leaders of a diocese and territorial rulers of a secular principality. They owed homage to the emperor, raised armies, minted coins, and administered justice, all while claiming apostolic succession. The 3 archbishops of Cologne, Mainz, and Trier were among the 7 prince-electors who chose the emperor. When a new king needed to be crowned, these archbishops did not just bless him. They voted. Their electoral power made them kingmakers, and their territories were among the wealthiest and most strategically important in the empire. The Archbishop of Cologne, for example, controlled the Rhineland, a corridor of river trade and fortified towns. His spiritual office gave him moral authority, but it was his army and his treasury that made him indispensable to imperial politics. The English bishopric of Durham took the model even further. Because the region lay dangerously close to the Scottish border, the Bishop of Durham was granted Palatine powers. He could raise troops, build castles, hold his own parliament, and pardon criminals. In practice, the bishop ruled the north of England as a semi-independent prince. Durham Cathedral was both a house of prayer and the administrative center of a military buffer state. The bishop appointed his own sheriffs, collected his own taxes, and led his own armies into battle. This Palatine authority was not a temporary concession but a permanent feature of the Northern See. It meant that the Bishop of Durham was simultaneously a spiritual father to his flock and a military commander responsible for defending the realm against Scottish incursions. His castle, Durham Castle, served as both his residence and a fortress. When the king needed troops for a northern campaign, he did not ask the local earl. He asked the bishop. This fusion of roles was not a corruption of the church's mission. It was the system. A bishop was expected to provide knights for his king's army, just as any other baron would. When a cathedral chapter elected a new bishop, they had to consider not only his piety but his ability to manage estates, settle disputes, and lead men. The Bishop of Strasbourg in the 13th century was a count first and a clergyman second. He commanded his own castle, sat in the imperial diet, and conducted diplomacy with rival nobles. His episcopal ring and mitre were outward signs of spiritual office, but the real source of his influence was the 1,000 armed men he could muster. He led his own retinue into battle, and his vote in the Diet carried the weight of a secular prince. The same logic applied at every level of the hierarchy. A parish priest might hold a small plot of land from a local lord, owing a few days of ploughing or a share of the harvest. A cathedral canon often managed property that required him to act as a secular administrator, collecting rents and overseeing tenants. The boundary between sacred and secular was not a wall, it was a gradient. This fusion created a fundamental tension. A bishop swore loyalty to the Pope, but he also swore loyalty to his king. He held his lands as a fief from a secular lord, but his spiritual authority came from Rome. What happened when those two loyalties pulled in opposite directions? When a king claimed the right to appoint bishops and to keep the revenues of empty sees for himself, he was not just meddling in church business. He was grabbing the richest territory and the most powerful offices in the land. The church, which had built its infrastructure by intertwining itself with the secular world, now found that the same ropes could be used to strangle it. The prince-bishops had become indispensable parts of the state machinery, and that entanglement left them vulnerable to the very forces they had once controlled. That entanglement was built into the very architecture of the cathedral close. It was not just a single building but a compound. the cathedral at the center, surrounded by the bishop's palace, the chapter house, the chancery, the treasury, and often a prison. These were the physical spaces where the church governed. The bishop's palace was an administrative headquarters with a great hall for audiences, a chapel, and chambers for scribes who produced documents by candlelight. That chancery was the engine of ecclesiastical bureaucracy. Every lease, tithe record, and appointment to a parish was written on parchment, sealed with the bishop's seal, and stored in the archives. Those archives were a medieval government's memory. Without them, the church could not enforce its claims to land or income. The cathedral chapter, the body of canons who ran the cathedral itself, added another layer of administration. They met daily in the chapter house, often a large room adjoining the cloister. There they managed the cathedral's own property, approved expenditures, and settled disputes among the canons. A chapter house was a boardroom with a sacred ceiling. The canons were not just priests. They were corporate executives who controlled estates that stretched across multiple villages. They collected rents, appointed bailiffs, and maintained accounts that were audited every year. The chapter's financial records, known as the fabric rolls, detail exactly how much was spent on lead for the roof, wine for the altar, and alms for the poor. These were not spiritual ledgers. They were the books of a medieval corporation. But the most visible administrative function of the cathedral was the bishop's court. Twice a week, the bishop or his official presided over hearings in a designated chamber within the palace. The cases ranged from moral offenses to property disputes over tithes and church lands. The court had its own jurisdiction, its own canon law, its own procedural rules, and because the church's authority overlapped with secular life, these courts often handled matters that would today be civil. Wills, marriage contracts, breaches of promise. In many towns, the bishop's court was the only regular court available for certain issues. That meant the cathedral was the local courthouse, the tax office, and the land registry all at once. Consider Old Sarum in England, where the cathedral and bishop's palace sat within a hill fort. The administrative pressure was so intense that a new cathedral was built at Salisbury on a flat plain, specifically to create more room for bureaucracy. The Salisbury Cathedral Close, laid out as a rectangular precinct, contained not just the cathedral but also a row of houses for canons, a school, a library, and the bishop's palace, all arranged in a planned administrative quarter. It was a government campus. Even the great papal palace at Avignon, though not a cathedral, embodies the same principle. The Palais des Papes was built as a fortress-like administrative complex with vast halls for audiences, a treasury vault, and a scriptorium for the papal bureaucracy. It shows how the church's need to govern shaped stone and mortar, and this is the concrete discovery. A medieval cathedral was never just a place of worship. It was the seat of a government that collected taxes, enforced laws, recorded landholdings, and operated its own courts. The architecture itself, the chapter house, the chancery, the palace, the treasury, was purpose-built for administration. When we look at a cathedral, we are looking at the original city hall. If cathedrals functioned as city halls, treasuries, and economic engines, it follows that cities treated them as competitive assets. Their height, ornament, and speed of construction became advertisements for civic power. In France, the rivalry began when the Abbey of Saint Denis built its Gothic choir in the 1140s. Chartres, rebuilding after a fire in 1194, raised its nave to 36 meters. Reims, where kings were crowned, vaulted to 38. Amiens reached 42. Then came Beauvais. Beauvais was a small bishopric with limited wealth, but in 1225 its cathedral chapter decided to build the tallest vault in Christendom at 48 meters, nearly as high as a 16-story building supported only by stone ribs and masonry. The choir was completed in 1272. 12 years later, in 1284, part of it collapsed. The structural failure forced a rebuild with extra columns, but the ambition did not stop. A central tower added later only worsened the load. That tower fell in 1573. The nave was never finished. Today, the unfinished Beauvais stands as a monument to overreach and the real cost of architectural pride. The competition was not just about height. Speed, craftsmanship, and visual extravagance also counted. In Italy, Siena planned a massive new cathedral in the late 13th century, intending it to be the largest in Italy. Work began on a nave extension, but the plague of 1348 hit the city hard, shrinking its population and its treasury. The extension was abandoned. Siena never completed its cathedral as originally envisioned. Meanwhile, Florence pressed ahead with its own Duomo. The wool merchant guild, the Art della Lana, managed the funding and construction. When Brunelleschi's dome was finished in the 15th century, it consciously outclassed anything else in Tuscany. Everyone understood the rivalry. What drove this race, civic pride, was part of it. A spectacular cathedral attracted pilgrims and their money. Relics drew visitors who paid for lodging, food, and souvenirs. The more impressive the building, the larger the flow of income. A cathedral also signaled that a city possessed the wealth and political clout to sustain such a project. City councils, not just bishops, often took the lead. In Florence, the commune asserted its authority over the bishop through control of cathedral finances. Councils voted to raise naves or commission new facades, statements of secular power as much as religious devotion. But this architectural arms race did not always strengthen the church. The strain appeared in conflicts over money. City councils contributed heavily to cathedral construction and demanded oversight of revenues. Bishops resisted. In some cities, the cathedral chapter and the commune ended up in open conflict over who owned the building and its income. The very success of cathedrals as economic infrastructure created new friction between sacred and secular authority. The buildings meant to unify a community became the scene of power struggles, and that friction kept building. This friction between city councils who funded cathedrals and bishops who governed them was not just fought in ledgers and legal documents. It was written into the stone itself. In the medieval world, every architectural choice carried a political message. Height, light, material, and iconography were tools for asserting authority, and the people who built cathedrals understood that perfectly. A cathedral nave that soared 120 feet from the floor was not merely a technical achievement. It was a statement. The taller the building, the more clearly it proclaimed the wealth and power of the institution that built it. When the Bishop of Beauvais pushed for a vault that would reach 157 feet, he was not just competing with Amiens and Chartres for the tallest church in Christendom. He was asserting that his diocese could command resources, engineers, and labor on a scale that rivaled kings. The collapse of Beauvais choir in 1284 was therefore not just an engineering failure. It was a political embarrassment, a visible sign that ambition had overreached its material foundation. At Chartres, the two spires are famously mismatched. The older south tower, built in the 12th century, is relatively modest. The north spire, added in the early 16th century, is nearly 60 feet taller and far more ornate. The cathedral chapter and the city had accumulated enough wealth by the 1500s to make a bolder statement. The new spire announced to every traveler approaching the town that Chartres was still a major power, still capable of commanding the finest stonecutters and sculptors. It was a competitive upgrade, like building a taller skyscraper to signal that a city had not faded. Flying buttresses, those graceful arched struts that braced the walls, were also political architecture. They made possible the huge stained glass windows that flooded the interior with colored light. But they were visible from the outside. a skeleton of stone that demonstrated sophisticated engineering and the budget to pay for it. When a cathedral added flying buttresses, it was saying it could afford the most advanced technology available. Other towns would see them, and competitive pressure increased. The stained glass windows were themselves political documents. The famous blue glass at Chartres was expensive. Cobalt oxide had to be imported from distant mines. The windows did not just illustrate Bible stories. They depicted the donors, guilds of butchers, bakers, bankers, noble families, bishops, and kings. Each panel showed a kneeling figure offering the window, their coat of arms or trade symbol clearly visible. This was public relations. Donors bought not just salvation but prestige, and the cathedral offered permanent advertising in the most visible medium available. The facades of cathedrals were even more deliberate. The royal portal at Chartres, carved in the 1140s, features Christ in majesty surrounded by the symbols of the four evangelists. Below him are figures of kings and queens of the Old Testament, because the Capetian monarchy claimed descent from Davidic kingship. Placing Old Testament monarchs on the facade literally carved the French king's divine right into stone. The church and the crown were presenting a unified front. God's authority flowed through both institutions, and their alliance was written in sculpture for everyone to see. This symbolism extended even to the floor plan. The cruciform shape of most cathedrals was a theological statement, but the placement of chapels and altars also reflected political hierarchy. The bishop's throne was located in the apse behind the high altar, the most sacred part of the building. Nobles and city officials had designated seats in the nave, often marked with their coats of arms. Processional routes reinforced who walked first, who stood where, who could enter the choir. The building enforced a social order. The medieval cathedral was not just a place of worship. It was a communication system that used stone, glass, and space to deliver messages about power, legitimacy, and wealth. Every soaring vault, every flash of blue light from a window, every sculpted king on a portal told the same story. The institution that built this has authority over land, over money, and over the people who live here, and that authority required constant reinforcement. When a new bishop arrived, he would often commission a new chapel, a new tomb, or even a new wing to the cathedral cloister, leaving his own mark. This was not vanity. It was necessary to maintain the institution's political standing. If your predecessor built a grand chantry chapel, you had to build something at least as impressive, or you appeared weak. If your predecessor built a grand chantry chapel, you had to build something at least as impressive, or you appeared weak. But here is the twist. The bishop was not the only figure inside the cathedral who had that kind of ambition. He was sharing power with a group of men who often had just as much money, just as much pride, and their own agenda entirely. Those men were the cathedral chapter, a body of canons who together formed something close to a corporate board, and they frequently did not see eye to eye with their bishop. The chapter had its origins in the clergy who served the cathedral. Over the early Middle Ages, that group evolved into an autonomous legal corporation with its own seal, its own treasury, and its own estates. Each canon typically held a prebend, a piece of land whose revenue was assigned directly to him personally. A canon could be a scholar, a local lord's younger son, a royal administrator who had taken minor orders. His income came from that prebend, not from the bishop's generosity, and that financial independence gave him real leverage. If the bishop wanted to raise taxes on the cathedral estates, the chapter could refuse. If he wanted to mortgage the church plate, they could block it. The canons were not just assistants, they were landed shareholders in the cathedral corporation. And they had teeth. In most dioceses, the chapter elected the next bishop, often after negotiations that involved the king, the pope, and the local nobility. A candidate favored by the canons had a much easier path to the throne. one they distrusted could be vetoed or forced to accept limits on his authority. Once a bishop was installed, the chapter remained his day-to-day partner and occasional adversary. It managed the cathedral fabric, the services, the archives, and often a substantial part of the diocesan finances. The bishop had his own estates and his own jurisdiction, but the chapter controlled the seat of his power. If a bishop wanted to remodel the choir or add a new bell tower, he needed chapter approval. And the canons were not shy about withholding it. The resulting conflicts could become legendary. At Lincoln in the 13th century, the chapter and the bishop spent decades locked in a legal battle over who had the right to appoint the cathedral bailiff, the official who collected rents and oversaw the cathedral estates. That was not a trivial administrative detail. The bailiff controlled the flow of revenue into both accounts. The case went all the way to the papal curia. At other cathedrals, the chapter sued their own bishops for encroaching on chapter property, and occasionally the chapter allied with the city council against the bishop, especially when the bishop tried to raise tolls or claim jurisdiction over urban markets. The cathedral was not a unified command. It was a battlefield of vested interests. To understand how this shaped the economy, we need to look at the chapter's own accounts. Many cathedral chapters kept meticulous registers recording every rent, every lease, every bequest. At St. Paul's in London, the chapter owned extensive urban properties, including shops, wharves, and tenements, and they leased them out to merchants and craftsmen at market rates. The canons were landlords, and they managed those assets with the same attention as any secular lord. When they needed cash for a building project, they could sell annuities or take out loans against future revenues. When they wanted to expand their holdings, they could trade parcels of land with the bishop or with local monasteries. The chapter was a financial corporation operating within the cathedral walls. And this internal structure matters because it explains why cathedrals did not always act with a single voice. When a city wanted to negotiate a tax exemption or a trade privilege, they did not simply approach the bishop. They had to deal with the chapter, which might have entirely different priorities. When a king pressed the church for a loan, the chapter could refuse, even if the bishop agreed. The canons guarded their treasures fiercely. They knew that their wealth was the foundation of their independence. That independence created one of the most concrete and lasting patterns in medieval political economy. A cathedral chapter could outlast any bishop. Bishops came and went, appointed by kings or elected after complex maneuvers, but the chapter was permanent. It held the collective memory, the archives, the legal precedent. So when a bishop tried to centralize power, the chapter had a centuries-old defense. They could produce charters from previous popes or kings that explicitly defined their rights, and they did, over and over, in court after court. The result was a system of checks and balances embedded directly into the stone of the cathedral itself. The bishop was the face of the church, but behind him sat a corporate body of canons who owned the house and intended to keep it. That corporate independence was built on more than land and tithes. It was built on something far more portable and valuable: relics. Relics were devotional objects, but they were also economic assets of staggering worth. A major relic could turn a modest church into a pilgrimage destination, drawing thousands who brought donations, purchased tokens, and filled local inns. The income from a single popular relic could rival an entire estate, so relics were acquired, stolen, traded, and negotiated over with the same intensity as any commodity. The most famous theft of the Middle Ages was the removal of St. Mark's body from Alexandria. In 828, Venetian merchants smuggled the evangelist's remains out of the city, concealed beneath a shipment of pork, which the Muslim guards would not touch. When the relics arrived in Venice, they gave the city not just a patron saint but an economic anchor for the Republic. The Basilica of St. Mark was built to house them, and the annual pilgrimage and commercial traffic that followed transformed Venice into a major power. The Relic was the seed capital of an empire. Relics also functioned as diplomatic currency. A ruler might exchange fragments of a saint to secure an alliance. A monarch could request a relic from papal authority as a visible sign of divine favor. The Holy Roman Emperor Otto III gathered relics from across the Mediterranean to bolster his claim as spiritual heir of Charlemagne. Possession of a sacred object was a political statement, a declaration that God had chosen you to guard a piece of the divine, and relics were used as guarantees in treaties and loans. A prince in need of cash for war could pledge a relic to a cathedral chapter or monastery, much as a modern debtor puts up a house as collateral. The relic would be held in the church's treasury until the debt was repaid. If the prince defaulted, the church kept the relic, and the prince lost both money and prestige. This created a powerful incentive to stay current on obligations. The relic system was a trust-based financial network stretched across Europe, underpinned by shared belief that the objects were sacred. But that belief system had a weakness. If relics were so valuable, the obvious temptation was to produce more of them. By the High Middle Ages, there were so many fragments of the true cross that, according to the reformer John Calvin, you could have built an entire ship from the wood. Reliquaries labeled as the skull of a saint appeared in multiple locations. The church itself was aware of the problem. Popes and bishops issued decrees against the sale of relics, but enforcement was nearly impossible because demand was insatiable. A town that could produce a convincing relic or even a newly discovered burial site could transform its economic fortunes overnight. The very system that made relics powerful made them susceptible to forgery. And forgery, once discovered, threatened the credibility of the entire ecclesiastical machinery. How could a cathedral claim divine authority if its most treasured object was a fraud? The church had to become a regulatory body, developing procedures for authenticating relics, requiring papal approval for new discoveries, and even destroying obvious fakes. But the line between authentic and counterfeit was blurry. Many relics had histories so tangled that no one could prove their origin. In some cases, the financial stakes were so high that it was better not to ask too many questions. This tension between economic incentive and spiritual authority would continue to grow. The church's trust and authority extended beyond relics into diplomacy. By the 11th century, the church had the only truly pan-European infrastructure. Its bishops, abbots, and papal legates moved along the same roads pilgrims traveled, carrying letters and messages across borders. Its cathedrals housed archives where treaties could be stored. Its monasteries educated the scribes who drafted the documents. Bishops themselves often served as diplomatic envoys, negotiating on behalf of their sovereigns. Europe had no other organization capable of communicating across the entire continent. The church was its communications network, its diplomatic core, and sometimes its court of appeal. The most striking early example is the Peace and Truce of God movement, which began in southern France in the late 10th century. Feudal conflicts were disrupting the region, and local bishops called councils demanding that knights swear oaths not to attack peasants, clergy, or church property. These were binding agreements enforced by excommunication, a sanction that meant a noble could be cut off from the sacraments and from the economic life of the church. The truce later expanded to ban fighting on holy days, covering nearly half the calendar year. The church used its moral and economic leverage to impose a kind of international law, and it worked, at least in part. The movement spread across Europe, and cathedrals became the venues where these oaths were sworn and recorded. The cathedral chapter not only hosted the councils but also preserved the documents, making the building both the stage and the archive of the peace. That same infrastructure enabled the papacy to act as a mediator in far larger conflicts. When the kings of France and England went to war during what became the 100 Years' War, popes repeatedly sent legates to negotiate truces. The papal treasury sometimes funded peace embassies, and when kings needed to resolve disputes over territory or inheritance, they often appealed to Rome. The Church offered something secular rulers could not: a neutral forum. A cathedral chapter could host negotiations. The bishop of a small diocese might be trusted precisely because he was not a vassal of either party. These mediations were not always successful, but the expectation that the Church should mediate shows how central it had become to the political order. Papal legates, themselves often bishops, carried letters and oral instructions across borders, relying on the hospitality and security of cathedral guesthouses along the way. Cathedrals themselves were often the sites of major councils that shaped European politics. The Council of Clermont in 1095, where Pope Urban Roman II called for the First Crusade, was held not in a palace but in a cathedral square. The Lateran councils met at the Pope's own cathedral in Rome. These gatherings brought together bishops, abbots, kings, and ambassadors. The cathedral chapter's staff managed the logistics, arranging accommodation and provisions for hundreds of attendees. The treasury provided the funds. The archives recorded the decrees and correspondence. Sacred architecture was not just a backdrop for diplomacy, it was the physical platform on which diplomacy happened. Without the cathedral's space, its staff, and its records, these international negotiations could not have taken place. But this role also created a problem. The more the Church became involved in earthly power, the harder it was to maintain its spiritual authority. When a pope mediated between kings, he was acting like a king. When a bishop negotiated a truce, he was acting like a prince. The line between sacred and secular blurred further, and secular rulers began to ask a dangerous question. If the Church could intervene in their affairs, could they not also intervene in the churches? They did, and no conflict demonstrated this more starkly than the clash between Henry Roman II of England and Thomas Becket. Henry had inherited a kingdom where the Church owned roughly a quarter of all land. Bishops controlled castles, administered justice, and collected taxes. To the king, this was not a spiritual arrangement but an infrastructural problem. If the Church functioned as a governing institution, he needed a say in how it operated. The flashpoint came over authority. When a bishop excommunicated a royal official or refused a tax, who had the final word? Henry demanded that clergy accused of crimes be tried in royal courts, that no bishop leave England without his permission, and that he have a direct hand in choosing bishops. Beckett, his former chancellor, now Archbishop of Canterbury, refused. He had been a man of royal power, but once consecrated, he became a fierce defender of church independence. The conflict escalated from arguments to threats. In 1164, Henry issued the Constitutions of Clarendon, 16 clauses asserting royal authority over the Church. Becket rejected them and fled into exile. For 6 years, the English Church existed in a state of defied authority. Henry faced the threat of excommunication, his own bishops torn between crown and altar. Then in December 1170, 4 knights who believed they were acting on the king's will entered Canterbury Cathedral and killed the archbishop at the foot of the altar. The killing sent shockwaves across Europe. Becket was hailed as a martyr. His tomb became a major pilgrimage site and economic asset for Canterbury. Henry was forced to do public penance. But the underlying dispute over who controlled church revenue and appointments was not resolved, only postponed. A century and a half later, the struggle repeated itself on a larger stage. King Philip Roman IV of France needed money for war and decided to tax the French clergy, something done before but only with papal consent. Pope Boniface Roman VIII issued the decree Clericis Laicos in 1296, forbidding secular rulers from taxing church property without papal approval and threatening excommunication. Philip responded by cutting off all funds from France to Rome and expelling papal tax collectors. The Pope backed down temporarily, but the clash was not finished. Boniface then issued the bull Unam Sanctam in 1302, declaring that submission to the Pope was necessary for salvation for every human creature, including kings. It was the most extreme statement of papal authority ever written. Philip did not answer with theology. He accused the Pope of heresy and corruption, sent agents to Italy, and had Boniface captured. The Pope died shortly after. The Church had no way to enforce its will against a determined secular ruler who had the support of his own clergy and nobility. The spiritual weapons of excommunication and interdict could be ignored or contested. Interdict, the suspension of all church services in a kingdom, might turn the population against the king, but if it lasted too long, it also turned them against the Pope. What the Beckett and Boniface episodes revealed was a structural weakness. The Church's revenue system, its land holdings, and its administrative networks all depended on cooperation with the secular world. That cooperation came at a price. When kings demanded a say in bishop appointments, they were asserting control over the very institutions that collected tithes, managed estates, and exercised local authority. The deeper complication was this: the Church had become so integrated into Europe's economic and political infrastructure that it could not disentangle itself without collapsing its own system. It needed secular rulers to protect its lands, enforce its tithes, and support its courts. But that same dependence gave rulers leverage. The conflicts over revenue and appointments were not isolated incidents. They were symptoms of a fundamental tension. The Church was both a spiritual authority and an earthly institution, and it could not fully be one without compromising the other. The conflicts with Henry Roman II and Philip Roman IV had shown that the Church could not fully control its own infrastructure without secular rulers. Yet when the Church decided to wage military campaigns on a scale Europe had never seen, its infrastructure proved not dependent on the crown. The crown depended on the Church. The Crusades were not just a religious movement. They were the largest military mobilization of the medieval period, requiring financing that dwarfed any cathedral building project. The Church had to pay for armies, ships, fortifications, and supplies across thousands of miles. Kings could raise taxes on their own domains, but the resources of any single kingdom were nowhere near enough. The only institution capable of extracting wealth from the entire continent was the Church. In 1188, after the fall of Jerusalem, Pope Gregory Roman VIII called for a new crusade. To fund it, he imposed the Saladin tithe, a tax of 1/10 on all movable property levied on clergy and laity alike, collected not by royal officials but by parish priests and cathedral chapters. The Church already had the machinery in place. Every diocese had its network of parishes where tithes were collected every year. The same system that gathered the regular tenth of agricultural produce was now repurposed to gather a second tenth for the campaign. In England, King Henry Roman II helped enforce collection, but the mechanism itself was ecclesiastical. Money flowed from village churches to cathedral treasuries, and from there to bishops who transferred it to the crusading army. The sums were immense. The Saladin tithe raised roughly 70,000 marks in England alone, the equivalent of several years of royal revenue. Over the next 2 centuries, the Church imposed repeated crusade taxes, each time using its existing revenue infrastructure to collect, store, and transfer funds across Europe. Kings who went on crusade, like Richard the Lionheart, borrowed heavily from cathedral treasuries and monastic houses. Richard's ransom after his capture was raised partly through a special church tax. The Church was not just a spiritual sponsor of crusade, it was the financial backer. But the key innovation in crusade finance lay with the military orders, especially the Knights Templar and the Hospitallers. These were religious orders that took monastic vows but also fought. Because they operated across national borders, they developed a financial network faster and more reliable than any secular system. A pilgrim or crusader could deposit money at a Templar house in London, receive a coded letter of credit, and withdraw the equivalent in Acre or Jerusalem. The Templars held deposits for kings, nobles, and bishops, and lent money at interest despite the Church's official ban on usury. They structured loans as repayments in kind, called them gifts, or calculated profit as a share of the enterprise. This was not just banking, it was a logistics network that moved silver, food, military supplies, and horses across a continent and a sea. Templar preceptories scattered across Europe functioned as fortified warehouses and staging posts. They collected taxes, stored grain, and maintained pack animals and ships. When King Louis Roman IX of France went on crusade in the 1240s, he used Templar networks to finance his entire expedition, including the construction of a new port at Aigues-Mortes. The Templars even built and operated their own fleet, the first multinational corporate navy, and then there were the indulgences. The Church learned that granting partial remission of penance in exchange for a financial contribution could raise enormous sums. By the early 13th century, preachers traveled through Europe offering indulgences to anyone who contributed to the crusade. This was not the later abuse that sparked the Reformation. It was a systematic revenue strategy. The money bought ships, supplies, and food. What the Crusades revealed was that the Church's infrastructure was not a passive economic system. It was an engine for large-scale military campaigns. The same cathedral treasuries that held relics and liturgical vessels now held crusade funds. The same parish network that collected the tenth of grain now collected a tenth for war. The same monasteries that produced manuscripts and wine now produced military supplies, and the same banking orders that transferred pilgrims' donations now transferred kings' ransoms. The Church's financial infrastructure was more sophisticated and more continental than any kingdom's. When a king needed to fund a campaign, he had to beg his barons and tax his peasants. When the Church needed to fund a campaign, it simply activated a system that had been in place for centuries. The Crusades were the ultimate expression of sacred architecture as infrastructure. The Church had become an engine for military operations, and that was a fact the kings who watched it happen would not forget. The same infrastructure that financed crusades also funded hospitals and schools. The Church's economic engine did not just build cathedrals and pay for wars. It delivered the essential social services no secular government could reliably provide. Take hospitals. The medieval hospital was a place of shelter, food, and basic nursing for the sick, elderly, pilgrims, and poor. Almost all were run by the Church. The Hôtel Dieu in Paris, founded in the 7th century and rebuilt in the 12th, could house hundreds of patients. It was staffed by Augustinian nuns and funded by donations, tithes, and revenues from church lands. Similar hospitals existed in every major town, often adjacent to cathedrals or monasteries. At the Hospital of St. John in Jerusalem, which began as a pilgrim hospice and later became a military order, care was organized into separate wards for different illnesses. This was not primitive charity, it was an institutional system. The Church collected the money, built the buildings, hired the staff, and operated the care. That system gave it direct contact with the most vulnerable members of society and made itself indispensable. Then there were the schools. As cathedral cities grew, cathedral schools replaced monasteries as the main centers of learning. A cathedral like Chartres or Lyon had a school with a master who taught grammar, logic, rhetoric, arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy, the 7 liberal arts. These schools attracted students from across Europe. Funding came from the cathedral's income, from tithes and endowments, and from gifts from wealthy families. From these cathedral schools, the medieval university was born. The University of Paris grew out of the School of Notre Dame. the University of Bologna had its roots in the Cathedral School of San Pietro. The church did not just teach the clergy, it taught the future lawyers, administrators, and diplomats who would run Europe, giving it direct influence over the formation of the next generation of leaders. The church social services were not a separate charitable appendage. They were part of the same infrastructure that collected tithes, built cathedrals, and financed crusades. The same cathedral chapter that managed estates and administered justice also ran the school and the hospital. The same tithe that bought stone for a new spire also bought bread for the sick. By providing these essential services, the church made itself the default provider of public welfare. No king, no noble, no town council had a comparable network. The church was the welfare state of the Middle Ages. That changes how we see these buildings. A cathedral like Chartres was not just a house of worship. It was the headquarters of an institution that educated its citizens, cared for its sick, and shaped its society. That role also made the church politically untouchable. If the king shut down the cathedral chapter, who would run the hospital? That indispensability extended to the very shape of the cities themselves. The cathedral was not just the social heart. It was the physical and economic anchor around which medieval towns grew. In many cases, the cathedral essentially created the city. Think about Salisbury. Before the 13th century, the cathedral stood on a hill fort at Old Sarum, cramped next to a royal castle with limited water and space. The clergy wanted out. So they moved the entire cathedral to a new site in the meadow below, and they laid out a planned town around it. Within decades, that new settlement, New Sarum, modern Salisbury, became a thriving commercial center. The cathedral was its reason for existing. The market square was positioned right next to the cathedral close. The street grid radiated from the church. The economic life of the city literally revolved around the cathedral. That pattern repeated across Europe. In Amiens, the cathedral was built in the heart of a growing city, but its construction transformed the surrounding neighborhood. The cathedral quarter became the densest part of town. Workshops for stonemasons, glassmakers, and carpenters clustered around the building site. When the cathedral was finished, those craftsmen stayed. The square in front became a permanent market. The chapter leased out houses and shops on cathedral land, generating steady rental income. The city government itself often met in the cathedral or in a building attached to the chapter. Cologne is another striking example. The city grew around the great cathedral from the 4th century onward, but the massive Gothic building begun in 1248 became a focal point for urban expansion. The cathedral's construction drew workers, pilgrims, and merchants from across the Rhineland. The cathedral's treasury became a regional bank. The archbishop, who was also an elector of the Holy Roman Empire, used the cathedral as his political and administrative seat. The city that grew around it became one of the largest and wealthiest in Germany. Its prosperity built on the economic gravity of its cathedral, but the relationship was not one way. The cathedral shaped the city, and the city shaped the cathedral. Urban growth created new wealth which funded further construction. The cathedral chapter, sitting on valuable urban land, became a major property developer. It would lease plots to merchants and artisans, creating a permanent economic zone around the church. That zone was often legally distinct. The cathedral close had its own jurisdiction, its own courts, its own rights of sanctuary. It was a city within a city, and that created civic identity. Townspeople began to identify with their cathedral. They donated money for its construction. They formed guilds to maintain its windows, and they took pride in its height and beauty. The cathedral became the symbol of the city's status. When rival towns competed, they did so partly through their cathedrals. Siena versus Florence, Reims versus Lyon, the competition was about more than architecture. It was about which city had the money, the power, the prestige to build the taller spire, the grander facade. So the urbanization driven by cathedrals was not an accident of history. It was a deliberate process. The church knew that a cathedral concentrated people and wealth meant political influence. The cathedral was the anchor that held the city together, and that made the city dependent on the church for its very existence. Discover that fact, many of the great medieval cities, the ones that still dominate Europe today, took their shape and their economic energy from the cathedral at their core. The cathedral built the city, and the city built the world we still live in, but that dependency bred its own tension. If the church controlled the city's economic engine, who really ran the city? The bishop, the cathedral chapter, or the secular ruler who granted the city its charter? For centuries, that question simmered, unresolved, as bishops acted as both spiritual leaders and feudal lords, their offices blending sacred and secular authority. In the late 11th century, it boiled over into a conflict that would redefine the relationship between sacred and secular power across Europe. Known as the Investiture Controversy, it was the first great showdown over who controlled the church's infrastructure, the land, the wealth, the appointments that made the medieval church the continent's dominant institution. At its heart was a simple, explosive issue: who had the right to appoint bishops? For centuries, kings and emperors had routinely chosen their own candidates for bishoprics, invested them with the symbols of their office, and expected them to act as loyal vassals. This practice, called lay investiture, was not seen as a violation of church independence. It was simply how the system worked. A bishop controlled land, wealth, and often military forces. He was as much a feudal lord as a spiritual leader. Naturally, secular rulers wanted their own men in those positions, but a growing reform movement within the church saw this as a corruption, a form of simony, the buying and selling of spiritual offices. How could a bishop remain spiritually pure if he owed his office to a king? How could he enforce church law against a monarch who had appointed him? The reformers, led by a fiery monk named Hildebrand, who became Pope Gregory Roman VII in 1073, demanded a clean break. Gregory declared that no layperson, including the emperor, could appoint a bishop. The power to invest bishops belonged to the church alone. He issued decrees asserting papal supremacy, claiming the right to depose emperors and absolve subjects from allegiance. The Emperor Henry Roman IV was not about to accept that. He controlled Germany and Italy, and the German bishops were the backbone of his administration. To let the Pope choose them would be to surrender control over his own realm. So Henry called a council at Worms in 1076 that deposed Gregory. Gregory responded by excommunicating Henry and releasing his subjects from their oaths of loyalty. That was the nuclear option. Excommunication did not just bar someone from the sacraments, it broke the feudal bond. Henry's nobles saw their chance. They declared that if the emperor was not absolved within a year, they would elect a new king. Henry was trapped. He had to make peace. What followed was one of the most dramatic scenes of the Middle Ages. In January 1077, Henry traveled to Canossa, a castle in northern Italy where Gregory was staying. The emperor stood outside the castle gates for 3 days in the snow, barefoot, dressed as a penitent, begging for forgiveness. His journey through the winter Alps and his public humiliation were a calculated performance, an act of submission designed to buy time. Gregory eventually let him in and lifted the excommunication. It was a stunning reversal. The Pope had humiliated the most powerful ruler in Europe, but the victory was hollow. Henry's penance was strategic. Once his political position was secure, he resumed the fight, even installing an antipope. The conflict dragged on for decades, with armies marching, bishops deposed, and whole kingdoms placed under interdict, meaning no church services, no marriages, no burials. The interdict was a powerful weapon, turning populations against their rulers by denying them the sacraments. Finally, in 1122, both sides reached a compromise at the Concordat of Worms. The emperor gave up the right to invest bishops with the spiritual symbols, the ring and the staff, but he retained the right to be present at episcopal elections and to grant the bishop control of his temporal lands. In practice, that meant the emperor still had enormous influence. The church won the principle of independence, but the secular ruler kept a hand in the process. The compromise did not end the struggle, but it established a framework. The Investiture Controversy changed everything. It established that the church was not just the spiritual wing of the feudal system. It was a separate, sovereign institution with its own claims to authority. For the first time, the papacy had openly challenged the empire and survived. That set a precedent for future conflicts between popes and kings, but it also created a new problem. If the church was independent, then its wealth and land were no longer under royal control. Kings would have to find new ways to tap into that wealth, which meant more tensions down the line. The controversy also forced the church to develop its own administrative and financial infrastructure. The papacy built a more efficient bureaucracy, a network of legates, and a system of taxation that reached across Europe. The cathedrals and monasteries that had once been local power centers now became part of a coordinated international apparatus. The church was no longer just a collection of landowners, it was a state. So when we look at medieval cathedrals, we have to remember that their soaring spires were not just prayers in stone. They were statements in a centuries-long argument about who would control the infrastructure of Europe. The Investiture Controversy drew a line in the sand. After Canossa, no one could pretend that sacred architecture was only about faith. It was about power, and the struggle for that power would reshape the map of Europe, forcing secular rulers to seek new sources of revenue and authority, while the church grew into a centralized political machine. The cathedrals themselves, once mere parish churches, became monuments to that transformation, visible proof that in the medieval world, the divine and the political were always intertwined. The Investiture Controversy gave the church a clear victory, but it also gave secular rulers a lasting lesson. To control wealth and power, they needed their own infrastructure. Over the next 2 centuries, they built it. King Philip Roman IV of France needed money for wars against England and taxed the French clergy. Pope Boniface Roman VIII forbade it in the bull Clarissus Laicos. Philip retaliated by banning the export of gold and silver from France, cutting papal revenue. Boniface issued Unam Sanctam in 1302, declaring every human creature subject to the Roman pontiff. Philip responded by sending troops to arrest the Pope at Anagni. Boniface died soon after, humiliated. The papacy never fully recovered. In 1309, the papal court moved to Avignon under heavy French influence. For 70 years, the Avignon papacy became known for its elaborate bureaucracy and aggressive taxation, alienating much of Europe. The English Parliament passed statutes in the 1350s to ban appeals to Rome and limit papal appointments. Other kingdoms followed. Then the Great Schism from 1378 to 1417 saw 2 and eventually 3 rival popes. The conciliar movement argued that a general council held authority over the pope. The Council of Constance in 1415 resolved the schism but also declared that councils could reform the church, a threat to papal supremacy. Although the popes eventually reasserted control, the church was no longer the unquestioned, unified infrastructure of medieval society. Meanwhile, secular rulers built their own administrative apparatus. The French monarchy created a treasury, a judiciary, and a standing army funded by direct taxes. The English exchequer had been centralizing revenue since the 12th century, and by the 14th century, kings relied on parliamentary grants of taxation. In 1290, Edward I expelled the Jews from England and seized their wealth. In 1307, Philip Roman IV destroyed the Knights Templar, confiscating their vast banking network. The Black Death that began in 1347 killed between a third and half of Europe's population. Tithe revenues collapsed because fewer farmers produced grain and livestock. The Church, as a great landowner and tax collector, struggled to adapt. Many priests died, and their replacements were often poorly trained. The Church's spiritual authority, already weakened by the schism, took another hit. By the 15th century, kings controlled national treasuries, bureaucracies, and armies. They negotiated treaties directly, bypassing the papacy. The Church still held enormous wealth, but its role as the operating system of Europe was over. The infrastructure that once belonged to the Church was being transferred to the nation-state, and its forms and functions would survive in ways that still shape modern institutions. The medieval Church did not simply vanish. Its systems, models, and way of organizing power became the template for institutions we live with today. The nation-state inherited and adapted the Church's infrastructure. Take banking. Cathedral treasuries functioned as secure vaults, and the Knights Templar developed a system of letters of credit, allowing pilgrims to deposit in one place and withdraw in another. When the Templars were dissolved, Italian merchant bankers like the Medici and Bardi adopted the same principle. They called it a letter of exchange, and it became the foundation of international finance. The word bank derives from the Italian banco, meaning bench, but the idea of a trusted institution holding money and transferring it across borders was perfected within the medieval Church. Every wire transfer and traveler's check descends from that Templar network. Then there is the university. The first universities in Bologna, Paris, and Oxford grew directly out of cathedral and monastic schools. The University of Paris originated as the School of Notre Dame Cathedral. The structure of a university with faculties of arts, theology, law, and medicine, a curriculum based on the 7 liberal arts, and the degree as a license to teach, all of that was developed within the Church's institutional framework. The word college comes from the Latin collegium, a term used for religious communities. The cloistered quadrangles at Oxford and Cambridge are architectural echoes of monastic cloisters. Diplomacy also owes its shape to the Church. Before nation-states, the papacy maintained permanent legations, ambassadors living abroad, reporting back, negotiating treaties. The concept of diplomatic immunity, the idea that an envoy cannot be detained or attacked, was first codified in canon law. The great church councils, such as the Council of Constance, were the model for modern international conferences. The Peace of God movement, sponsored by bishops in the 11th century, established the principle that certain places and people, churchyards, clergy, pilgrims, were protected from conflict. That idea of sanctuary and protected status eventually evolved into the laws of war and the protection of civilians. Social services were another legacy. The medieval Church ran hospitals, almshouses, and orphanages. The Hôtel Dieu in Paris, founded in the 7th century by a bishop, is still a functioning hospital. The model of charitable foundations, endowed with land and rents to care for the poor, inspired the modern non-profit sector. The idea of a trust or foundation as a legal entity that outlives its founders was perfected by cathedral chapters and monastic orders. And consider architecture. When new nation-states built their seats of government, they borrowed heavily from sacred tradition. The dome of the United States Capitol draws inspiration from St. Peter's Basilica in Rome and the Pantheon before it. State capitals across the American Midwest rise from the landscape with porticos and rotundas that evoke the grandeur of a cathedral nave. Architects were not copying churches by accident. They wanted those buildings to project the same sense of permanence, authority, and civic pride that great cathedrals had once embodied. The most visible legacy is not stone or financial instruments. It is the very concept of an institution as a durable, self-governing body with rules, property, and a mission that spans generations. The medieval church was the first organization in Europe to achieve that scale. It designed the framework of committees, budgets, legal codes, and record-keeping that every modern institution now takes for granted. That framework did not disappear when the church's political power waned. It was handed off to the university, the treasury, the bank, and the diplomatic corps. The dome of a state capital still echoes the dome of St. Peter's, a direct architectural lineage from sacred to civic power. Yet for the medieval mind, that architectural lineage was not a transfer but a continuity. The church was not separate from the world. It was the operating system on which everything else ran, serving as both sacred institution and secular infrastructure. This duality, built into every cathedral and monastery, was not a corruption but a functional necessity in a world without states. The medieval church's greatest legacy is not any single institution, but the idea that a society can be organized around a common good. Yet that idea was made real through physical and institutional infrastructure that shaped every aspect of medieval life. Chartres was never merely a house of God. It was a center of land management, a collector of tithes, an employer of artisans, and a magnet for pilgrims who brought trade. The land donated by kings and nobles gave the church its foundation. The tithe system turned every household's obligation into a predictable revenue stream that funded cathedrals, monasteries, hospitals, and schools. Pilgrimage routes like the Camino de Santiago became commercial highways lined with inns, markets, and money changers. Monastery granges operated as corporate farms, innovating agricultural techniques that fed entire regions. Treasury vaults held the deposits of nobles and kings, functioning as the medieval equivalent of banks. Bishops wielded both spiritual authority and secular power, governing cities and administering justice. Cathedral chapters were the administrative boards of urban life. This was not a church that occasionally dipped into worldly affairs. It was the infrastructure through which a fragmented world held together. The church collected taxes, administered justice, stored wealth, funded wars, educated children, cared for the sick, and mediated between rulers. When emperors and popes clashed over who appointed bishops, they were fighting for control of that infrastructure. The struggle was not about theology alone. It was about who would command the most powerful administrative machine of the age. And when the dust settled after Canossa and later conflicts, the infrastructure remained, but the balance of power had shifted. That brings us to the defining insight we have been moving toward all along. The medieval church was not a spiritual institution that occasionally dipped into worldly affairs. It was the world's most sophisticated institutional infrastructure before the nation-state existed. Its decline was not simply a reformation of doctrine. It was a transfer of that entire infrastructure to a new master. The national treasury replaced the papal treasury. The royal bureaucracy replaced the cathedral chapter. The standing army replaced the crusading order. The university system, the banking system, diplomatic protocol, and even the architecture of power in state capitals and courtrooms all carry the DNA of the ecclesiastical institutions that came before. We still live inside that inheritance, though we rarely recognize it. The dome of a capitol building echoes St. Peter's for a reason. The secular state took the church's blueprint and built its own version, often using the same stones. The modern tax system is more efficient than the tithe, but does it carry the same sense of collective obligation? The state now administers justice, educates children, and funds wars, but it does so without the shared moral purpose that once animated public life. That sense of purpose did not die. It was reincarnated into new forms we are still trying to understand. So the next time you stand before a medieval cathedral, look past the spire and the stained glass. See the cathedral as it truly was, A hub where heaven and earth met, but also where tithes were counted, kings were made, armies were funded, and the shape of the modern world was cast. That entanglement of faith and power is not a relic. It is the foundation of how we organize society today. Which medieval cathedral do you think best illustrates this blend of spiritual and economic power? Share your thoughts below. Subscribe for more deep dives into the hidden history behind iconic places and periods.